Hello, I'm Beth Cougler Blom, and this is Facilitating on Purpose, the space where we talk about designing and facilitating learning. In this episode, it's a solo one with me. Thanks for choosing to listen to this episode today. I am going to be answering a listener question. If you follow me on LinkedIn, personally on LinkedIn, Beth Cougler Blom, then you may have seen me ask this question a few weeks ago. I basically put out that I was preparing to record a solo episode, and did anyone have any questions that they really wanted me to address on the podcast? So I had a few of you responding. Thank you very much. And I chose to respond to a question from Doug S. Doug is a learning and technology consultant, and I'll just paraphrase his question because it's just a little bit long. It was really meaty. But Doug basically said that one challenge he frequently encounters is supporting instructors as they transition from traditional lecture-based delivery to more collaborative, learner-centered instruction. And he was really wondering, do I have tips? Do I have strategies? How do I work with instructors or other people to transition them away from that more presentation or lecture-based style to more active learning or participatory methods? I love Doug's question because I really talk about this a lot. If you've listened to other episodes, you've definitely heard me share some of these strategies, and I can give some of those recommendations for other episodes at the end of this episode. But I thought this was interesting because Doug's approach was really, how do we work with other people to convince them basically that an active participatory learning approach is better than a more traditional lecture-based delivery? So I'm going to couch my response to how do we all work with other people to try to help them through this kind of learning. But of course, if you're someone who's a faculty member out there, a facilitator, workshop leader, whatever you call yourself, and you are also struggling a little bit with how to break out of the presentation or lecture mode and to design more effectively in a more engaging way, then of course, listen to this as well, because really you are the person that I am giving this answer to, but I'll just couch my response in how do we all work with folks to help them go in this direction. You may know a little bit about my background if you've listened to this podcast before, but in case you're just tuning in for the first time, I'll just briefly say I've done this work a lot. I've worked with hundreds of faculty members over the course of my career so far. I worked at a post-secondary institution for 7 or 8 years here in British Columbia in a teaching and learning center team. And over the time I was with them, I worked with dozens and dozens and probably hundreds of faculty members. I also have had my own business since 2011. So right now it's 2025. And so 14 years I've been doing this kind of work, specifically as a consultant and as a company, working with clients in various sectors in various ways to help them with this same cruxy kind of issue. Because actually this is everyone's issue in some respects, because a lot of us did grow up attending learning, whether it's our university program or high school or wherever it was that we learned, a lot of us learned through lecture-based instruction. And so we just tend to do what we saw or what we were a part of. And so it's super, super common for those of us who are learning designers or instructional designers, when we work with people, whoever they are and whatever they call themselves, it's really common for us to work with them and try to help them out of this lecture-based or presentation mode delivery. And that delivery word is so intentional here. We saw delivery, and so people tend to do delivery when they first start teaching or first start facilitating workshops. So I've done this for many, many years. I've had this conversation over and over again, but it's kind of interesting to just think about it in terms of, how do we convince people that this is a good thing to do? This is a good shift to make. So thank you, Doug, for the question. And I will try to do it justice with some of the things that I talk about and I think about when I have that kind of convincing type conversation towards creating participatory active learning environments. As you listen to some of my tips, you might be thinking about your own situation, as I mentioned, or you might be thinking about someone that you work with, you supervise, you're a colleague with in a post-secondary institution or a corporation or a nonprofit or wherever you are. So just think about yourself, but also think about the people that you facilitate with or teach with. And maybe at the end of the episode, you might want to send this one to someone as well, or maybe your whole team, and you could talk about it at your next team meeting. I mean, I would love that if you just just used it as an opportunity to have discussions to propel yourselves forward in terms of your professional development around facilitating learning. Okay, so let's get started with some of the key points that came forward for me when I read Doug's question and thought about what I would say in response. So, the first thing that I want to address is around the necessity to establish a relationship or culture, if it's a team based thing, of continuous improvement. And so it's kind of like taking a few steps back and just saying, okay, well, maybe if we're a learning designer working with a faculty member or a learning and development manager working with a facilitator, maybe it's not just about them, right? It's not just about their skills and their growth as a facilitator. That's absolutely the center of it, but what's happening around the person or people that we're hoping to help. And let's just look at the team environment or the department environment, even the school or university environment or the corporate environment that you're within. And what is the culture there related to how people professionally develop and how they work with each other and collaborate, and what's kind of kosher, I guess, or not in your kind of environment. And I'm thinking here about a conversation I had several years ago. This is just kind of an aside, but for 5 years, I taught a course in design thinking methods. And I had some folks in that class at one point in one of the iterations of it. They happened to be from a government organization. And they told me that in their environment, they would never bring any half-formed work to their colleagues. They really had to, when they worked on projects, they had to bring polished work to their colleagues in order to get feedback on that. They didn't bring any half-formed work or any sort of half-baked ideas. And I thought that was really telling about their environment. And there were 2 or 3 people that all worked in the same organization that were in my class. I actually thought it was kind of sad, to be honest. And I hope that this is not where you work and this is not a situation that you're in where you are. But if you are, I would hope that you could have some conversations, take some time, even shape meetings in this direction to try to bring your culture wherever you are or wherever the person is facilitating that you're supporting into this continuous improvement kind of mindset, kind of culture. And maybe it's just the relationship you have with this one other person that you're trying to support, and you're working on the relationship to try to normalize giving and receiving feedback, seeking out each other's support, and that kind of thing. So the more that we just treat facilitation and learning about facilitation as something that is a lifelong journey that we're all trying to get better at all the time, and normalize that people will make mistakes and learn from them and do need to reach out and get ideas from each other and have things go wrong and talk about it with each other and get each other's help and ideas, the more we just normalize that that is very typical in this work. There's so many variables when we design and facilitate learning that we cannot do it all by ourselves. So wherever you are, if you can just keep working on the culture of the environment where the facilitators are and just normalizing the giving and receiving of feedback and seeking out each other's support to be more effective on an iterative basis, then I think that's going to lay some of the groundwork that's going to help further conversations around moving people out of lecture and other challenges that they might have. So one way you could do this is bring up the conversation at meetings, and you could make it a standing meeting agenda item. You could also bring in goal setting practices around preparing for a certain facilitated event. I remember once I was preparing for a workshop that I taught fairly frequently with a number of other people, and I said, we should be setting goals for our facilitation as well as setting goals for what we want to have happen in the session or for learning outcomes or whatever. And that was something that we had not been doing in that environment yet. The facilitators had not been getting together and talking about how we wanted to grow our practice. So bringing in some sort of goal setting practices for yourself in terms of your facilitation and how you want to grow would be a great idea. Of course, if you're supporting the person, then just encouraging them as much as possible to set their own goals for each time they facilitate or teach. What do they want to achieve? And is there anything particular that they're working on? And just encourage people to do more goal setting, not just around the content of the course, but around their own facilitation practice and how they're growing it. That's the development side of being a professional in this field. And in post-secondary, we call it faculty development. We can call it facilitator development in other settings, but just what kind of development are you fostering and are you encouraging? Even if you're not the leader of the team, you can still play a part. And what are you doing to encourage that to happen in your environment? So establishing a relationship with the person you're supporting or with the team that you're on or supporting of continuous improvement would be a great place to start. We've done work on an organizational level a couple of times with just helping organizations come up with a learning strategy. And often organizations like nonprofits, for example, they'll have a strategic plan, but it's more about the work that they want to get done, not necessarily how the learning is going to happen. So a learning strategy would be a really good supportive document and practice, not just a document, but a practice to help people grow in their facilitation of learning events, whatever they might look like in your organization. So culture and relationship comes into that very much so, laying that groundwork so you can have further conversations. Following on that, one thing that I've really tried to do over many, many years, and I did this when I worked with faculty, and I still do it when I co-facilitate with folks, is never really leave the facilitation of a workshop and just never reflect back on it. So let me say that another way. After every workshop or course or even meeting that I facilitate or co-facilitate, I will look back and think about what went well, what didn't go as well, look at the feedback forms, because of course we would have sent those out, and just normalize that practice for myself or with the other person I'm working with to debrief the experience of facilitation. And then following and including in that to identify improvements for next time. When I worked in the post-secondary environment, I instigated a meeting I used to call closing the loop with the faculty that I worked with. And it was really unusual for anyone to do that on the instructional design team at the time. And I just thought, well, why wouldn't we both spend the time up front with the faculty and then have them go and teach the course and then get together with them after they taught the course and debrief how it went. And weirdly enough, it just wasn't happening in the environment. It probably is now, but this was a few years ago. So basically, anytime you are supporting someone to go out and teach something or facilitate a workshop or a course, I would really recommend you both are part of that design process with them in some ways, or ensuring that that formal design process is happening. Have them go off and facilitate, or facilitate with them if you're the co-facilitator, and then make sure you have a debriefing meeting where you go back over what happened, look at the feedback forms, and just normalize again the practice of debriefing that experience and expecting that some things would have gone really well and some things would have not really hit the mark. And that's just normal. That happens to all of us. It still happens to me, even though I've been facilitating for more than 20 years. There's always something in the spirit of continuous improvement that I would have wanted to do better, or maybe my colleague would have wanted to do better. Or actually, sometimes it's not a thing, right? Maybe they wanted to do something and I thought it was amazing, and they're maybe a little bit incorrect in their assumption of what happened, and we can allay each other's fears about whether something worked or not. So just prepare, facilitate, but also debrief the experience of facilitation with the intent that you're always going to improve. And that happens in little ways over time. And it all adds up to something wonderful, growing a career in facilitation. A third thing that I would recommend is if you're supporting someone who you're really trying to, as we've mentioned, help get them out of that lecture mode or presentation mode and to encourage them to be more participatory in how they facilitate the session that they're doing, I think we should bring a coach approach to the conversation. So we've talked about coaching before when Mo Poirier came in one of the very early episodes of the podcast. I'll put it in the show notes for you. But Mo and I talked about how facilitation and coaching are so related. And I actually took an introduction course to coaching itself at one point, many, many years ago. If you've never taken coaching training and you're a facilitator or you're supporting someone who's facilitating, coaching training would be amazing for you to consider. Because when we learn about coaching, we're learning about facilitation. And as many of us know, we can coach on a one-on-one basis and we can facilitate on a one-on-one basis. So when we're having conversations with our colleagues or people we supervise or support about how to help them shift their facilitation practice in more effective ways, having a coaching approach to that conversation would be really wonderful. And one of the big things, if I remember correctly from my coaching experiences, is that we ask good questions and we get the person to bring up what's going well for them, what's difficult for them. And all we're doing is asking really good questions of the person to try to get them to tell us what they need, what they know, what they're looking for, what's hard, and all those things. I think we need to recognize that people usually do know if they're kind of hitting it out of the park or not. That expression here in Canada means if they're doing a really great job. So if people are doing a really great job, it feels good. They usually know that that's happening. On the flip side, if there's trouble spots or difficulties in what people are doing in terms of their facilitation, they usually know that as well. It's almost sometimes a visceral feeling. They'll walk away not feeling confident about something. They would have known that when they asked a question, they didn't get any responses. People kind of had blank looks on their faces. In my experience, usually people do know if there are problem spots in their workshop or course that they're facilitating. So when I talk with those folks, I just say things like, so are there any places within the workshop where you feel it didn't go as well as you'd hoped? Or maybe there's something that didn't get as much engagement as you were looking for? And just opening up those kinds of points for them to bring up where they felt it could have been lacking for themselves. I don't want you to be scared of asking these kinds of questions because maybe you might think, oh, well, it assumes that something did go wrong. Well, you know what? Something always goes wrong. There's always something that we could do differently, more effectively, whatever. Again, we're just normalizing that there's always something to improve on. Back when I used to work in volunteer management, I'm going to relate this to that field because we used to think, or some folks used to think in that field, that they could never discipline volunteers because, oh my gosh, these people have come and they're giving their time for free to whatever this venture is, and how dare we give them any feedback on their work that would make them feel bad about whatever they're doing. But actually, when I taught volunteer management for 10 years and I was a manager of volunteers, and of course I've been a volunteer myself in many, many ways over the years, I know now, and we used to teach people that volunteers want to be improved. They want to know when they're not doing as good of a job as they could because they don't want to be there to sort of screw up. They want to be successful in their role. And I just say that little example now and relate it to working with facilitators or working with faculty members because I think most of us actually do want to do a good job in our role. And so we should never be afraid of bringing up a developmental conversation with someone because if we do it the right way and have a productive conversation about it, they are going to be able to move forward and be more effective in the role. So just learn how to bring the coach approach to the conversation, ask those open-ended questions, ask about places where the person feels it might not have gone as well as they'd like, but also really help them focus on the areas where they have strengths as well, because there's always going to be something that you can have the person talk about or you can reflect back to them where they did a really great job and you want to see more of that. When I taught the instructional skills workshop many times in the post-secondary environment, one of the ways I used to give feedback was not to say, oh, well, what you did in that spot was incorrect. We usually just couched it in terms of alternatives. So in that workshop, we facilitate a conversation about the person who's taught a little mini lesson, like a 10-minute mini lesson. And then we give written and verbal and video feedback. And so when I facilitated those kind of feedback conversations, I would say things like, so in that point when Jerry was doing this, is there any idea that any of you have where he could have done something different in that situation? Or are there alternatives that you might have done yourself in Jerry's place? So phrasing some things like alternatives or just, how you could have done it a different way is not saying that the person did an incorrect or bad or terrible job, but that there are alternatives always to how we do things. And one of the alternatives might be more effective, or at least it's something to try for the next time. One thing that people often will tell me, and it's a real dead giveaway for where problems are in a workshop, is where they've reportedly asked the group a question, as I've said, and they get crickets. I don't know if you know that expression. Here in Canada, we'll say, oh, you ask a question, and if you get crickets, it basically means that nobody is saying anything, no one responds, and if you think of it being like you're outside, all you would hear is kind of the chirp, chirp of crickets, and no voice is responding to that question. Looking out for the places or having the person look out for the places where the crickets are happening means that there's something going on there that probably can be fixed. Typically, it's a question that doesn't engage people. It's maybe a throwaway question, like I've talked about in my book. If we just say, oh, does anyone have any questions? That's a throwaway question. That doesn't engage people. In fact, it's usually asked at the end of a session and people want to get the heck out of there. So don't ask the throwaway question. Plan your questions in advance and look out for those spots where you get crickets, because it is usually a sure sign that something could have been asked more effectively, or perhaps you could have even just redesigned the whole section to be an activity instead of a lecture or presentation piece. So bring a coach approach to the conversation with the person and really try to get them talking about the places where they felt they had strengths and where they would like to make improvements, and start with those places. When we learning designers work with people who teach and facilitate, we are not in the business of helping them change absolutely everything that they're doing about their facilitation for the next workshop. It's so impossible. So one of the things I tend to talk about with people is kind of like the big things that we want to deal with now, or we want to talk about now, and then save some other types of enhancements for the next time around. Especially this was useful with faculty who teach the same course 3 times a year or whatever, because we would identify certain challenges, maybe 3 or 4 different challenges they want to fix. And then we would fix the first 1 or 2, but we would leave like the 3rd or 4th for the next iteration. We would just see how much time we had and how big of a job it was to redesign or that kind of thing. So just recognize as you're supporting whoever it is that Rome wasn't built in a day. They sometimes say we can't make all the fixes ourselves or for the other person or with the other person for the next time they facilitate, because again, it's a journey. We're always learning and we just can't do all the things all the time. So try to pick some of the most common challenges or the most pressing challenges the person's facing and leave some other things for later. Okay, so we've gone through some key points of establishing a relationship or culture of continuous improvement. We've also talked about normalizing the practice of debriefing the experience of facilitating a course or workshop with a person after the event has finished. We've talked about how to bring a coach approach to the conversation, or that we should bring a coach approach to the conversation, kind of a little bit about how we do that. And now I want to go into how I share messages of how making changes will help based on what we know about how people learn. I'll back up a slight step here and say, I don't tend to talk about a lot of real research, like quoting research with the people that I work with, because I recognize that I'm a learning designer. I geek out on research and reading and, looking at LinkedIn posts and listening to podcasts about my field, and I do all the things. I don't necessarily give all of that to the people I'm working with. So I definitely pick and choose of the many, many things that we could be talking about. I pick and choose what I tell the person about, and I don't tend to make it very academic. So I'm always trying to read all of the things that come out from researchers in our field and practice that people have written about, but I don't lay that research on the faculty members or on the clients that I work with. I do find a way to talk in plain language about how people learn in general based on all of that reading and learning that I've done. Like, I did a master's degree in this work, and for the last 20 years, I've read tons and tons of resources around it. Like, I have the intellectual background to tell people about. But are they going to be really interested in all the hundreds of pieces of information that I have in my brain about this? No. I have to really drip feed some of the most pressing things that I think that they would really benefit from. So some of the big ones that I talk about are just around experiential learning, that people need to be involved and do something actively, and they need to be given opportunities to reflect on their experience. And they need to make connections between what's being introduced, that's the new information, and what they already know or what their experience is. And so one way I put it is that people, yes, we can learn through listening, but actually we need to get people involved, and they learn more through doing or through those application pieces. And so every time that we're working with someone to help them get out of presentation or lecture mode and into more engagement, it usually looks like translating some of their lecture pieces into the facilitation of activities. And I've done other sessions on choosing activities and why learning outcomes are important related to that and all that kind of stuff. So I'll put those in the show notes for you if you want to go and have a couple of other listens related to this. But generally, I have the conversation with people about how lecturing is very normal for us because we've seen it and grown up with it, as I've already said, but that if we really want people to learn, they have to be given opportunities to discuss something, to do something, to get their brain involved in whatever the content area is. And that's the way learning happens. That's the way they make meaning from the new thing and kind of hook it on to whatever they know about from the past. The mistake that lecturers or people who default to presentations will make is thinking, oh, I'm the only one that knows about this topic, so I better just deliver all this information to these people. But actually, it's a brain shift that we have to help those folks make and say, no, actually, in this day and age, there's no way that one person has all of the knowledge about the particular topic. We have to facilitate learning instead of make presentations in order to get all of the people's ideas out onto the table or into the discussions, and we can make connections and make it relevant and learn from each other. So it's a fallacy to think that one person standing at the front of the room will have all of the content. And that's why I don't like the word deliver. They're not delivering content. They're facilitating learning. And so some of these messages about just why people need to be involved and engaged and to make meaning and how that happens for folks and how that translates into the learning is all stuff I try to share in just an easy way and hopefully a quick way, usually, as I don't have hours and hours to work with each person to help them prepare. But we do our best, right, to tell people why we do the things we do so that effective learning happens on the part of the participants. Another thing that I often bring up, especially these last few years, is that people are different from each other. And there's many ways to say this. And I think we just have to recognize and tell the person we're working with that these groups that we have, they are diverse every single time we facilitate the thing, the session, whatever it is. Every group we pull together, it's full of unique individuals, and they're different from each other and they need different things. And so, yes, you might have a few people in there who really love learning from lecture. And I'm not saying we can't learn from lecture, but lecture, when it goes on too long, is really difficult for some folks. And we know with neurodiverse folks these days and other reasons why people can't listen for a long time and retain, that we need to mix things up in our facilitated sessions. And we turn to things like universal design for learning to help us do that. Again, it's a way to get people involved and to make meaning for themselves. the way we design and facilitate sessions. So this goes into the realm of inclusive facilitation, accessible facilitation, and so on. But we just can't expect that any faculty member or any facilitator can be all things to all people, just delivering information in one mode. It's just not going to work for all of the learners. Somebody or several people, or maybe many people in each group will be left behind if we only stick to one mode. So it doesn't say that we're not going to present for a few minutes here and there. Of course, there is some information that we need to tell our groups when we're facilitating, but we're not going to do that for very long before we get people to talk about it and discuss it and do some activities around it and reflect on it so that they can hook that new learning onto what they already know or their experience. The cool thing is that when we incorporate activities, it's actually easier to facilitate, and it's more fun to facilitate as well because the room comes alive and people start talking with each other, and they maybe are moving around the room and they're working with props or they're working with materials, and we can check our lesson plan and figure out where we are because they're doing work. It's so much easier to facilitate a well-planned, a well-designed session that's full of participatory learning techniques than it is to do the brain dump of information for a long lecture or a long presentation. So when I work with people who are learning facilitation, that's one of the things I usually say that, if you learn how to design outside of your PowerPoint deck and use a true lesson plan or whatever it is that I can get them to kind of release their control on the deck, the slide decks, I really want to help them realize that when they use these effective design techniques, it will be easier for them to facilitate, and it should be more fun as well. And you know what? The other thing I say around that is when people are able to facilitate learning and they run activities and then they get their participants or their learners to say things in the room, then they learn as facilitators as well. They realize, oh my gosh, there's something that someone said that I didn't know as the facilitator. And isn't that so fun? I think those of us who really geek out on learning, we love to learn new things. And so if you have someone that you're working with who loves to learn, that could be another thing to say to them is like, you are going to learn from your participants as well when you release your control from the slide deck and from that presentation mode, and you start to facilitate conversation more than do those lecture dumps. You're going to learn. And actually, you're going to become a better facilitator because of that, because you're going to get to know your students or your learners more. And it might just enrich your life as well. So get excited about learning for the sake of learning and help the people that you're working with do the same. Hopefully they're bright sparks and they're facilitating for a reason. And you can kind of capitalize on that lifelong love of learning that hopefully they have. Lastly, the thing that I just always keep coming back to is that when we help people present less or lecture less and facilitate activities more, it just plain works. I've seen it time and time again. And I'll just share one last story with you that hopefully illustrates this. When I used to facilitate, again, the instructional skills workshop, I keep coming back to that when I talk about some of this type of work of helping other people learn how to facilitate, because it was such a good workshop. And it still is if you're still working. I haven't been involved for a few years, but when I taught the instructional skills workshop, it was a model where every participant facilitated 10-minute mini lessons once a day for the 3 days. So everybody would do 3 mini lessons. There was this one time when I was facilitating an iteration of the ISW when I was working with one of the people in the group was a faculty member, but they were also a lawyer. And when they quote unquote facilitated their 10-minute mini lesson, they never let any of the participants in their little group talk at all. They lectured at the little group for the full 10 minutes, did not ask a question of the group, did not facilitate any activities, didn't allow anyone to say anything, just kind of had slides, talked at them for 10 minutes, and then sat down. When we were able to facilitate the feedback for that, of course, we talked about how it would be more effective to facilitate activities and ask questions of the group and all of the things that we can start to get people to think about. And this person really took it to heart. And the reason why I know that is because I didn't see them on day 2 because they went with my co-facilitator, because we split up the group and half the group went with the other facilitator for the mini lessons, and then half stayed with me, and then we would switch. So I saw this person on day 1. I didn't see them on day 2. And then I saw them again on day 3. And when they stood up and they facilitated their 10-minute mini lesson, it was a true facilitation. They were asking questions of the group. They had planned a little activity for them to do. I was astounded because between day 1 and day 3, this person had made such a remarkable transformation. They had really taken in the lessons and the feedback that we had given them on day 1 and presumably on day 2 where I wasn't with them. And day 3, they had transformed the way they facilitated that 10 minutes. And I just hope that in the years to come, it affected their facilitation of their courses just 100-fold, because I saw the transformation and we could feel the difference of what that facilitation was in the room. And it was just wonderful. It was just one of the best transformational experiences that I ever saw with someone coming to that workshop. But of course, it happened time and time again because it was such a great experiential workshop and involved reflection and all those good things that we've already been talking about. So it just plain works. When we talk about getting out of presentation or lecture and into the design and facilitation of active learning environments, it works. And I've seen it, and it's more fun. So there you have it. Thank you again, Doug S., for your great question. And obviously I had a lot to say. This went a little bit longer than I was hoping for, but I get so excited about helping people do this work. And I hope that you do or will as well. I love having these kinds of conversations with people because, as I said, they do want to do really well at their job of facilitating learning. And when they haven't been taught how to do it very well, they need help. And if you're the one that can help them, you need to do it. And you will do it well with some of these techniques and hundreds of others that I haven't been able to talk about here today. Feel free always to reach out if you have any questions. Do scan a lot of the other episodes that we've talked about so many of these concepts, either in my solo episodes or ones with various guests where we talk about connection and all those kinds of things, universal design for learning and various other topics. Just keep learning yourself and keep bringing your excitement to the people that you work with. And good luck with that journey of professional development and facilitator development wherever you are. On the next episode of the podcast, I talk with Chanchal Garg. Chanchal and I are going to be talking about conscious facilitation, all about intentionality and creating psychological safety for difficult conversations, being direct and being compassionate. Join us next time. I hope you will. Thank you so much for listening. You can find the show notes, including transcripts for all episodes, at facilitatingonpurpose.ca. Feel free to reach out to me about any episode to share feedback. And again, if you would like to share this episode with someone who you're supporting to become a more effective facilitator, this would be a great one to share. And I would thank you so much for doing so. Thanks again to Mary Chan, as always, for her fantastic editing support on this episode. Until next time.